That's that. Just to start off, I kind of want to get you guys oriented a little bit to what the Tree Keeper program is, right? So you're here because you want to learn more about trees, which is totally fine. Some of you also want to go ahead and become tree keepers. You want to volunteer with tree planting, right? And so you can take this whole series and you will just know more about trees and a little bit more about volunteer engagement. Or you can take all of this and then you can apply this to becoming a tree keeping volunteer. So the Tree Keeper program is really a partnership, and that's why you see all three of us here today. And so at this point, it's really a partnership between Keep Durham Beautiful, the City of Durham, and as extension, we do some of the training, just because where I sit in my job, I do things like I lead the Master Gardener program, I help lead a Master Naturalist program, and so what I could bring to the table is I was like, hey, I'm good at training volunteers. I don't want to manage volunteers. I have enough volunteers to manage, but I'm good at training volunteers. And so you guys will receive your training here, and then we will give your information once you pass this class to Keep Durham Beautiful and to the City of Durham, and they will be able to reach out to you with volunteer opportunities. And so what they'll do is they will periodically say, hey, we have these tree plantings coming up, and you'll sign up for whatever floats your boat, right? So I would always love to hear from you after class is over, but that's just kind of like the transition that'll happen. And you'll hear a little bit more from Keep Durham Beautiful next time. Again, it'll be mostly through monthly newsletters. And in this class, what we're going to cover is, this first class is really going to be tree basics and planting. Next class is going to be picking the right tree. So a little bit of some different trees you might consider for an area, and also actually early tree pruning. We won't go as much into large mature pruning because you wouldn't really be doing that as a tree keeper. And I would say even as like a homeowner, unless you're very comfortable with a chainsaw, I would recommend the moment you think you need a chainsaw, you should actually probably hire someone because chainsaws are gnarly and can do really bad damage. And that's kind of my cutoff. So I'll kind of be guiding you up through the to right before I think I might need a chainsaw. Okay. And then in the last class, we'll do kind of a review. And then we will also talk about volunteer leadership. And if you attend all three classes, at that last class, you will also get a spiffy laminated card so that when you are out on the street doing tree keeper things and people are like, what are you doing? You can be like, well, pow, right? So we'll have a little bit of a yay, you get your laminated card at the end. So just to give a little bit more information about who I am, because I always kind of want to know who is this person and why are they qualified to talk about this. I grew up in central Indiana. Every summer I went to camps in southern Michigan. That's why I'm in love with making aspen and cottonwood and these kind of trees. I then went to undergraduate at Indiana University where I studied juncos and birds and other things like that. I worked in a community garden and a food pantry that focused on volunteerism. That was my job, as I was actually doing volunteer engagement there. I studied dung beetles. That was my major course of study, was dung beetles. The ones that bury dung, not the ones that roll the big dung balls that you see on TV. I think they get all the press. These guys are doing amazing things though for, that died. These guys are doing amazing things though for soil improvement. So remember, respect the barriers. I came here to Durham to go to Duke, where I was quite confident of two things, which is that I wanted to study insects and I didn't want to do field work. So I ended up doing 3 seasons of field work on plants. I studied a little West Coast wildflower. I would plan out, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 of them on a hillside at a time and figure out what they were all about from an evolutionary perspective. After that, I thought that's all great, but this seems very wonderful and romantic, but it actually lends you to sitting at a computer for long periods of time and never seeing another person because now you have to do data analysis. I fled the scene. I decided I wanted to work with volunteers. I wanted to share research, and I ended up here at Extension. And so I've been here since 2018, and I love it. I love working with the Master Gardeners. I love working with homeowners, landscapers, everyone on kind of these landscape questions. So this is probably my 4th or 5th time teaching the Tree Keeper series. It's really a pleasure, and I really like working with you guys because you're very excited, totally all about it, and it's only 3 classes, and we get to have fun, and then you go out into the world and prosper tree-wise, which is great. So a little bit of an overview for today. We are going to cover first tree biology, and remember, I'll be sharing a recording at the end, and I will be sharing slides. So don't ever feel pressure. We're going to talk a little bit about what trees need, planting 101, and then we're going to head outside and we're going to plant a tree. by plant, again, remember, that tree's also going to come back out of the ground and it's going to go almost onto you. So one of the places I like to start is I don't think I have to convince you guys that trees are great, but there's actually a tremendous amount of research showing that trees are like even more great than we realize. So I think a lot of us fall in love with trees because they are pretty and shade is nice and all of those wonderful things, but it's a lot more than that. So there's research showing that trees can lower temperatures by about 10 degrees, right? So having trees over your house especially is going to lower your heating and cooling bills because they provide both a buffer and shade. Trees, we know, reduce violent crime. So they have done actual research where they go in and they add trees to areas. So it's not even just correlative, it's causative studies where they add trees and they find controlling for everything else, you can reduce crime in a number of areas. We know that they can improve health outcomes, right? There's a lot of research showing trees and other plants can do things like pull pollutants from the air. So there's a really interesting study, I forget where it was one of the Scandinavian countries, where they added trees and small plantings in planter boxes right along the street, and they looked at how much particulate pollution was getting into houses, and it was meaningfully reducing it. And so there are all these kind of benefits, and they can provide just screening, they can provide beauty, right? Beautiful bark, right? Not even just flowers. Like, let's be real, there's some amazing exfoliating barks out there. They're going to provide shade. They are going to do kind of all of these different things for us, for pollinators, for everything around us. And there's kind of this tremendous diversity of what we're going to see in trees. And yet, one of the things I find really fascinating is that like most of us don't quite know what to do with trees. Like even if we're gardeners, there's like plants and then trees, right? Trees are plants, but like we still view them a little bit as like plants and trees. And so I'm going to try and demystify some of that for you. And as Julie alluded to, right, trees provide absolutely vital habitat for so many different things, right? So native trees serve as the host to many other organisms throughout their life, right? Whether they are providing cover, whether they're providing food, whether they're providing whatever. Many of you are probably familiar with Douglas Talmy. He wrote Nature's Best Hope. It's been like everyone's favorite book for 5 to 10 years now. But the interesting thing is one of his more recent books, he just took a deep dive into oaks, right? Because they really are bang for your buck, one of the best things you can do for the environment, for your landscape in terms of adding habitat. Yeah.
Just FYI, Doug Talmy's going to be here speaking at the Cary Environmental Symposium Friday. Nice. So it's sold out, but if you really want a ticket, let me know.
All right.
Because my organization's hosting it. So.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's really, really cool. Yeah. My dad's been reading this for like 6 months, and every time we talk, he's like, let me tell you about this book I'm reading. Got it, thank you. So very, very good, very interesting, a lot of good facts in there. But really, when we think about trees, they're just providing so much more than even just food, right? They're providing habitat, they're providing all of these other things for so many different animals and insects. But like this point I made earlier, right? These are both pictures from Ralston Arboretum. This is their native plant trials, and people come out every year to see how the their annual plant trials, how their annual plants are doing. They get wildly excited. There's a huge market for this. And then they have this amazing collection of trees and specifically Japanese maples and redbuds. And everyone's like, oh, that's interesting. But like, tell me about the plants. And you're like, they are plants. You can do this too, right? Like this could be you. So thinking about that, I want us to take a step back and think for a minute about what are plants really, and what makes plants special. So this first part of the talk is going to be like plant biology, and it's going to be a lot of actually soil health. Because, spoiler alert, soil really matters for plants. And so it'll be helpful to you to understand a little bit more about that. So the thing that makes plants special, as we all know, is that they can use sunlight to convert CO2 to sugar. This is a crazy trick, right? That they are able to pull carbon out of the air, use sunlight, and make the sugar that they built their bodies. For the chemistry nerds keeping track at home, right? That looks something like this. We're going to take carbon dioxide and water, use the power of the sun, and create sugars and oxygen, right? This is a really, really big deal. They're going to then use those sugars and carbohydrates to build basically their entire body, all structures. And so the vast majority of what you see in a plant, right, is carbon. Other nutrients are important, for sure, but just the bulk of it, the bulk of all of us, right, is carbon. And if you think about that, where does my carbon come from? It comes from plants, actually, right? Whether I'm eating animals or plants, if I'm eating an animal, that animal ate a plant, right? So all this carbon that we have access to is because plants were able to pull it out of the air through photosynthesis, right? So this is kind of pointing to this idea of why are they essential? It's because this is the basic way you get all usable carbon into like terrestrial ecosystems, right? So plants are a big deal. There's a reason we like plants, and it's because they can do this sort of action. The reason we care so much oftentimes about native plants is because insects then eat the plants, and insects and plants have these really complex co-evolved relationships, right? Plants are not like making a bunch of sugars because they're altruists and they just want to help us all and they're just like really excited about being part of the team, right? They're doing it for themselves. Insects are typically the ones who come along and then eat them, and then somebody else eats an insect, and so on and so forth. And so the plants are very, very well defended. They don't want to share their sugars. And so the insects have to have really special relationships where they like know how to eat around the spine or like know how to not be bothered by the like toxic compound or whatever it is. And so native plants can be really helpful because they're co-evolved with our ecosystems. So thinking about trees a little bit more specifically, and this is really, really, really important for when we think about pruning, so I'm going to kind of front load this here. If you remember anything from all of this, it is that plant cells don't move. Okay, animal cells can move. That's a thing we can do. Plant cells don't do that. When they are laid down in one place and they stay there, right? Remember, like when you learned about cells in whatever grade and they were like, a monk looked through a microscope and he noticed they look like cells, right? Like he was looking at cork, basically, and it was square and everything stayed together. And so because plant cells don't move, it means that they heal very differently than we do. And we'll talk about that in a second. And it means pruning it's very important to get your pruning cuts right. So plant cells don't move. So if a plant wants to get taller, or in a tree's case, wider, it has to figure out a way to do that because it has to add it to the outside or it has to add to the top. So trees are going to add cells in two ways. They're going to add them in primary growth, which is adding to the ends. You might have heard before about meristems, right? These are special growth points at the tip of the plant, right? Like at the very, very growing tip or the very growing tip of the branches. The ones at the top we call apical, the ones on the sides we call lateral. It doesn't really matter. The point is that they have a special group of almost like stem cells at each one of those active growth points that can add more cells. And that keeps marching along as it adds more. These cells in here, I can't add more cells in between. So trees have something very special where they can also, they have almost like meristem tissue along in here in the cambium layers, and they can add cells out, which is why a tree can get wider, right? But it's not like the same bark is always moving out. It's like there's bark, and then it kind of like new cells get added out, new cells get added out, new cells get added out. That's what we consider secondary growth. And so this is why a lot of times in old trees, what you will see is when they're really big and wide, it's not uncommon to see a tree that is actually almost like hollow in the middle. You've probably seen that before where you look down at the base of a tree and it's all like rounded out, and there's like, you assume some like magical chipmunk cave in there or something. That's because really that growing tissue, right, that's actively expanding out, that's actively doing all of the work of the tree, is in this very outer edge. And this heartwood, which can be really hard, it can also actually start slowly giving out, and it can slowly start rotting. And a lot of times we have big old trees that have a cavity in the base that are still fine, because there's so much structural stuff and there's so much active growth still going on around that tree. Okay. So again, these meristems are really, really important. They're going to be at the growing tips of both branches and the top of the tree, and also at the roots, right? So the roots have to get longer too, so they also need meristems. That's how that's going to work. The reason this can be really, really, really helpful to know is because if I have a tree and it's growing up, what happens is that this very top one, let's say this is that very, very top one, apical meristem at the very top of the tree, it actually suppresses the growth of the lateral ones often, so that that tree can go up and can go straight. those side ones you can think of as almost like an insurance policy, right? If something happens to that very top one, those side ones can take over, right? Like you've seen that happen before, right? Where a tree gets topped, like it gets broken at the top, and some like weird branch comes from the side and it's just like, I'm going for it, right? And starts going up. This top one is actually suppressing these, and the moment it's removed, these laterals can start growing. And they're gonna race until a new one becomes the top, and it starts suppressing all other ones. Which is when we talk about pruning, why you might not wanna do topping cuts. Because you think you're gonna do one thing, what you're actually probably gonna end up with is like an explosive little shrub on a stick, right? Because all the side branches started going for it, right? That works really, really well if you're trying to create a bushy basil plant. But we do not typically want our trees to look like bushy basil plants, right? We want one strong growth point. The kind of major exception to this that I want to share is just that many narrow-leaved evergreens, and especially pines, don't always have those side buds. They don't always have axillary buds. And that's why, if you've ever seen a pine tree that was like limbed up, I always think of it as like looking like it's like skirts a little bit too short, like it's uncomfortable, you know, you can kind of see too much leg. If you're into seeing too much leg, that's great. I'm not trying to judge that. I'm just saying like the tree looks uncomfortable. It can't grow that back, right? And that's because some of the narrow-leaved pines, or narrow-leaved evergreens like pines, they can't regrow those side branches the way we think our deciduous trees would. So when you're pruning them, you just need to be a little bit thoughtful about what you're growing and how you're pruning and how you're gonna do it. Because there are places where they can't grow back the way you would want them to. So again, just in case you want to see that more kind of literally, right? Imagine this is a young tree, right? So you're going to have your apical bud right there at the very top, and you're going to have these side buds. You might call them laterals or axillary buds. These are growth points. If I were to flip this right here, what would happen? Right? These guys would explode, probably these guys would explode. Somebody would come up and be the winner again. Yeah?
In that case, Ashley, would there be two apical buds, or is there always only one that wins out?
They'd like fight for a while. They'd both go up, and then one would get a little bit further. Like one would end up winning, but you could end up certainly with like a double leader, right? Which we'll talk about with pruning, but it's a situation where, especially with a larger maturing tree, instead of having one strong leader, you end up with two or even three, and neither of them are really as strong as a single would be, and you can have problems.
Like structurally?
Structurally, yeah, structurally. So if that were the case, if this thing got topped and both of these went up, I would probably wait like a year, maybe a season, see which one looked better, and clip the other one. You know, I would step it in and be like, no, we're only gonna have one winner here. Okay. So the other thing that can be very important, and this is trees, this is plants in general, is understanding the vascular system. For trees, this is especially important because they look big and mighty, but all of this tissue is really right at the surface, and it's very easy to kill a tree by messing with this. So xylem transports water and nutrients from roots to leaves. Phloem is kind of its counterpart. It transports sugars from leaves to the rest of the plants. So I always think of it as like phloem being like food, sugars being transported. But so basically it's that you have transport of water and nutrients. And when we're talking about trees, we're really thinking about that being organized actually in, it's kind of hard to see in this picture because it's like actual tissue, but there's a bundle right here, there's a bundle right here, there's a bundle right here, where that's all arranged in a ring. You can kind of see this ring of the xylem and the phloem pretty near the surface. And so if you've ever heard of girdling a tree, right? This is this idea that if you go all the way around the base of a tree and you nick in, you know, not even that deep, you can kill it. It's because you've broken this vascular system and now the top and the roots can no longer communicate, right? And so it's one of the reasons that sometimes you'll see those little guards put on the base of trees is so that someone doesn't come along with like an ambitious weed whacking scheme and just kill the tree, right? Because they've nicked it all the way around. And that line where those two meet, you might have also heard the word, right, like the cambium, right? So that's really on the tree what you want to be careful with the cambium. And if you're ever interacting with a tree or another woody plant and you're not even sure if it's alive or not, something I like to do is you can take your fingernail and you can scrape off the first layer of bark, and if you can find a bright green layer, that's the cambium. If it's green, I'll be like, give it more time, right? Like maybe he'll come back, like it's fine, maybe just drop his leaves. If you scratch and all you're finding is brown, or especially if it snaps easily, that plant's done. So especially if you're looking at things in the winter when the leaves are off, or if you've had a plant that got really stressed and dropped all of its leaves, check to see if you can find that green by scraping first. And so one of the really cool things that happens with the vascular tissue and what makes trees so amazing, and one of the reasons they're so good at cooling, people think trees cool everything because of shade. It's actually transpiration is a huge part of it as well. So transpiration is the plant version of sweating, and what's happening here is it's able to cool the plant and the surrounding areas just the way sweating works for us, right? So it pulls water up from the roots through the leaves, it evaporates off the surface of the leaves, and just the way water evaporating off your skin cools you, that cools the plant, but it also cools the surrounding area. The unfortunate thing about this is that it does require adequate soil moisture, so when plants start getting hot and dry, like we've had very recently, but we haven't had a lot of this year because it's been so wet, they have a hard time doing this, and I can actually really stress them out. But in kind of a nicely balanced system where temperatures are good and water is good, this is very, very effective at cooling areas, right? Like the cooling action of trees is not just shade, a huge part of it's transpiration. There's research that shows, right, a large oak can transpire about 40,000 gallons of water per year, right? So that is massively cooling for the surrounding area, and it's one of the reasons like our large oaks around here are so effective. As that tree's growing out, right, this is what we were talking about, right, with that secondary growth, the marching out. This is why you see tree rings, is because the tree has to lay down one layer of growth each year, basically, and as it marches out. And one of the cool things is actually in more kind of tropical environments where you don't have hot and cold and wet and dry quite as much, you tend to see a breakdown of tree rings, and it becomes like much muddier because they're growing a little bit more continuously. But this is just kind of a really cool thing that right when you look at the stump of a tree, you can tell exactly what was going on with the vascular system. You can tell if there were really wet years, you can tell if there were really dry years, harsh years, because they're gonna have different widths of tree rings. And so I'm building all of this kind of up for us to talk a little bit about what happens when a tree is injured. And that's because when we get injured, we think like, oh, it's gonna seal up, and maybe I'll have a tiny scar, but you won't really be able to see it because everything can kind of fix itself. I can heal, right? Trees can't heal because, like, the same way we do. We say, you know, plants seal, we heal. And so how do they do that? They do it through this process called compartmentalization of decay. And so, right, we've spent a couple minutes now talking about how the tree is essentially like a long tube of vascular tissue, right? Like it's a bunch of tubes moving sugars and waters up and down. It's all very near the surface. It's very easy to get damaged. This is a problem. And it can't like send extra cells in to fix anything, right? Like it's got to figure out a way to basically just stop movement so that if a pathogen gets in or if a disease gets in, it doesn't spread. So if you imagine this tree is injured, right? Like maybe right here he's injured. Oh no, what do we do? First thing that tree is going to do is it's actually going to plug up the vascular system above and below. It's just going to say, okay, it's like, yeah?
I'm just going to...
Oh, go for it. Yeah. Good call. It's just going to say like, oh my gosh, if a fungus gets in, please, like, just don't let it move up or down, right? Like, just plug, okay? The next thing it's going to do is it's going to try and create a barrier so that the fungus can't move this way, right? Or the disease can't move this way. After that, if you were to look down in cross-section, it's going to start plugging it so that it's almost like it can't move laterally, right? Like it can't, now the disease can't move up or down, it can't move in, it can't move laterally, right? It is plugged on all sides. And then finally, once all of that is kind of resolved, the tree is going to finally start trying to callus over that spot or trying to form kind of a barrier over that spot, or at least close it as best it can. When we do our pruning cuts properly, and we do them at the bottom of a branch, and we do them kind of all situated right, the tree has the resources it needs at that point to make that final seal a little bit better. it's a little more capable of it. When that final thing has to happen just randomly on some spot in the bark where it got whacked, it like has a harder time and it doesn't do it quite as gracefully, and the seal won't be quite as good. Oftentimes, those first 3 internal walls fail over time, which is why you get things like hollow centers on trees, right? It's like the disease does spread slowly over time. And so I have a disc I'll bring for next time. That's just out of a tree when we were cutting something out at the hub farm. But you'll see oftentimes when you cut trees, right, these perfect lines of where those walls were formed, right? So the disease gets in, the rot gets in, but that tree was able to form those interior compartments. Yeah.
Is there anything you can do to encourage this? Like, if you do see there's damage?
Not really. They used to tell you, like, paint the wound or whatever else, and that's kind of like, wear a Band-Aid for 2 weeks straight, and you're like, that doesn't sound, just logically, that doesn't sound right. So really the best thing you can do, you don't want to paint the wound, you don't want to tar the wound or anything else like that. The best work is prevention, right? Doing good cuts with sharp tools at the right spot, and we'll talk about that next time. The second best move is just seeing what other things you can do to help reduce the stress on that tree, right? And that's in general a good thing when a tree is mature or older, has something going on, is I would be like, if it gets real dry out, give it some water, right? Like, just be kind of extra kind to it, mulch around it, try not to like put heavy things around it, you know, give it some space, give it some time, give it some water, just be kind of nice to it, because the tree can do this the best itself, and there's not too much we can do to really drastically improve, at least as homeowners, improve its outcome. Again, people heal, trees seal. So another big part of tree anatomy, one of the comparisons I always really, really loved was the idea that when we think about tree roots, trees are like a wine glass on a dinner plate, right? So they are so much wider and so much shallower typically than we really think. And so when you think about absorbing roots, these are super, super fine roots that are actually taking up nutrients, taking up water. They're kind of doing all that really, really essential work of like getting the trees the things it needs. Those are typically in the top 12 inches of the soil, and they are vast, right? So they're going to go in all different directions. They're going to take over, right? They do often go out wider than the drip line. We think of that as like, oh, the roots, like, you know, you've probably heard like everything underground is as big as what's above. And you're like, I guess, I don't know, maybe. It's probably shallower and wider, right? And there's definitely lateral roots and sinker roots that really anchor that tree, but those fine absorbing roots are what's really getting at its nutrients and what's feeding it. And this is something we have to think about with street trees and urban trees a lot, is it does mean that when you have things like sidewalks or you have things like roads, right? The tree can't grow under that street and get anything there, so it's probably not going to have as much grown under there because it's just growing toward nutrients and toward water. And so then you get these kind of really lopsided root systems, and root systems that are not able to access everything that a tree just growing out in the, like in a field would be able to. I was out walking a couple of years ago now, and I saw someone, and what they had done was, I think they were trying to be very, very kind to their new young trees, and so they took up all the grass around the trees, and they tilled all around those trees, all around the base of these trees, to put in a different ground cover. Sounds very nice, but where are all the feeder roots? They are where you just tilled, right? You just ripped them up. I think these trees survived, which I was like shocked by, but they look a little rough, right? So in general, when we're thinking about things like tilling, which I would like to discourage you from in general, but when we're thinking about things like tilling or massively disrupting the soil, when we're thinking about like putting heavy equipment, you know, or having a big load of lumber dropped off or anything like that, we want to kind of stay away from the base of trees. And we want to give them a little bit wider girth than even their canopy might suggest, because that's where so many of our most valuable roots are. Fun. And part of the relationship that so many of us have heard about between trees and their roots extends even further than the roots themselves, right? So oftentimes plants and trees, they will form relationships with mycorrhizae, with fungus, that really effectively extend the reach of their roots. And so the way this works is it's kind of a complicated relationship where the fungus is going to grow its little mycorrhizal roots, and the benefit it gets is that it gets those photosynthetic products, right? The carbohydrates, the sugars that the plant's making. And then the benefit the plant gets is that it gets water and nutrients, a little bit better availability by having that relationship, right? So they're kind of trading resources with each other and getting hooked up that way. This is a great picture of a pine seedling where you can see that the roots of the pine extend about this far, and all the rest of this is the mycorrhizal network, right? That's kind of extending its reach. There's been kind of a lot of hubbub over the last couple of years that, maybe trees are like linking up even from tree to tree through these mycorrhizal networks, and people started getting wildly excited about this. I think we got a little over our skis on that one because there was like, maybe they're talking and they're communicating and they sense some threats, and you're like, that sounds really cool, and actually like plants can do a lot of crazy stuff that you don't realize. But the research definitely does show that different plants have different relationships, and they're all really, really valuable for promoting the growth of those plants when they have these relationships. Some plants don't do this at all, but a lot of them do. Okay, so what do trees need? We know a little bit about trees, right? We know a little bit about how they grow, we know a little bit about their roots. Can't say anything for certain, because like trees grow everywhere, but almost all trees want relatively even water. They like that. Low sunlight exposure for the soil, right? They don't want their roots baked. Ample space above and below ground when possible. This one is kind of interesting because I 100% agree with this, and also our tendency to take trees that naturally grow in forests and to give them wide amounts of space above ground does give us a responsibility to then do some pruning to kind of get them back to where they want to be, because they're like, I thought I was going to be in a forest. I'm in the middle of a park. And they get their wires crossed, but we'll talk about that in our pruning class. But give them more space than less. High biological activity in the soil, we'll talk about that in our soil section. And a moderate organic content in the soil, right? They all kind of like that. For the most part, anything you're growing around here does not want to be on a scraped suburban lot on clay with no organic content getting baked in the middle of the day right up next to the house, right? Like that's not what they want, that's what we want for them. That's not what they want, and we can do a little bit better and get better outcomes. So that transitions us a little bit to soil, right? Because our last 2 points were about soil. And this, we're gonna spend a lot of time on this. If you're thinking about plants, you're probably actually thinking about soil, right? And you might not realize that yet, but I'm gonna try and convince you that if we think more about soil, we're gonna get better outcomes. So what does soil do? It provides plants water, nutrients, oxygen, and an anchoring point. This is what like a basic soil does, right? A really good soil can manage water flow, right? So it can help with so many of the stormwater issues we have because it's taking in a lot of excess water. It can break down waste, pollutants, provides habitat for any number of different things, and reduces water and nutrient inputs. So you're gonna have to water less, you're gonna have to fertilize less, you're gonna have to do everything less when you have a really good soil. This point is crazy to me, that breaks down waste and pollutants. Like the first time someone really explains to you what a septic field is, and you're like, okay, so the idea of a septic field is that we're gonna put a lot of human waste in a big thing underground, and then we're just gonna let it slowly eke out into the soil, and the soil is really so effective at breaking that all down that like we've all agreed this is an acceptable thing to do. And it does, right? Like soil, when it has good microbial activity, is amazingly effective at breaking down any number of things, right? Like it will just chew up and spit out any sort of nasty you throw at it, if it's healthy, if it's living, if it's biologically active. So when we think about soil, I would challenge us to think about it in kind of 3 major ways, and we'll cover these briefly. The physical properties of soil, the chemical properties of soil, and the biological properties of soil. I think that sometimes we get more hung up on these first 2 and we neglect the last one, but luckily there has been a big push, I would say, over the last decade or so to really start thinking about the biological activity of soil, and that's been really, really helpful because this is kind of, to my mind, where the magic happens, right? So we have pictures of some different soil structures here. We have a little bit about chemistry, a little bit of a teaser about biology. And so when we think about soil, what we're really thinking about is this idea of everything that's on the ground, right? And we think about it as like space and stuff, right? So soil could be, it's the mineral component, about that more. It's the organic component, which despite all of our urges to fill our raised beds with like 75% compost, it is actually totally fine to have an organic content of like 5 minus percent, right? Like if you had 3 to 5% in a actual soil out in the yard, I'd be like, rock and roll, like you're good, you know? And then you actually have all this space between those soil particles, and you want that to be filled with air and water. And so one of the things that's so hard about our clay soil is that oftentimes the soil particles get so compacted that the space gets squished out. There's no air, there's no water, and plants need both air and water to take up nutrients and also for their roots to breathe. And so in a healthy soil, you'll have all these different sizes of soil particles, you know, from sand grains down to salt to clay. You'll have them organized into little bits that are then organized into bigger bits and organized into bigger bits with channels all between, right? Like imagine like a bunch of ants or a worm wiggling through here, right? And so when the water hits that soil, it's able to move through these open spaces. It gets trapped in some of them, which then can water the plant for a long period of time. Others, it just moves through, so then you don't have a lot of standing water, right? Like it's able to both hold and move water. If you imagine our soils, and if you take this and you just, right, compact it massively, the water hits it, it runs straight off the top, and then you don't have any water anywhere for anything, right? So the major reason that happens is because of the different mineral particle sizes. So you can think of sand as being like a volleyball or a basketball. You can think of silt as being like a tennis ball, but not fuzzy, but size-wise. And you can think about clay as being like a grain of rice, significantly smaller and shaped differently. So if you had, imagine a big cylinder full of basketballs or volleyballs and you poured water through, what happens? Gone, right? It's like spilling your drink at the beach. Like it's not coming back, right? If you have that same cylinder full of clay and you drop the same amount of water in, what happens? You might see it at the bottom, you might not. It'll be a while, right? Like it's gonna get stuck in there, it's gonna get stuck in the rice. And this is what happens in our soils, right? So the water gets stuck, everything's so compacted, it's really, really difficult. For the most part, if you're in Durham, you're dealing with a clay soil. If you're in this area, we'll talk about why. You know, if you're out at the beach, you're dealing with sand. That's an entirely different thing. But we're often dealing with clay, and it can be really, really frustrating. And so just in case you're curious about, like, that's great, the soil is not actually made of volleyballs and rice, what are you trying to tell me? Right, this is sand taken with just kind of a regular microscope, like just like a small magnification. These are clay particles. So you can think of them as like grains of rice, almost like a deck of cards, right? Like different types of clay particles are going to be a little bit different, but this is pretty common where they're almost sheets. And so in a perfect world, you would have a combination of all of these together because they help space each other out and they have different benefits. In our world, we just have a lot of that stuff on the right. And so one of the major things that happens is that the benefit to this is that these clay particles are so tiny that they have really large surface area. So why does that happen? I was not gonna do the slides, but I'm going to because it's fun. So clay, if you think about a particle of soil, whether it's sand or clay or whatever it is, all along the outside, typically there are a lot of negative charges. We're getting into something here that's gonna feel like chemistry. It's fine, you guys can do it. Okay, like we're just gonna hold our hands through this. So you have all these negative charges, and on clay particles, right, you imagine that's an even smaller thing, so you have even more surface area, so you have even more negative charges, right, because the negative charges are on the surface, so as you break that particle up a million more times, you get more surface area, yeah? And why that matters is because you have these clay particles, and then so many of our plant nutrients actually exist in the soil as charged particles, and many of them are positively charged, okay? And what they want to do is they want to stick to those soil particles. And they stick just tightly enough that they don't wash away, and they stick just loosely enough that a plant can grab them if it's lucky, right? So in a sandy soil, you don't have as many of these nutrients stuck. And you don't have as good nutrients in sandy soils. Oftentimes you have to fertilize more, you have to think about it more. Your plant nutrient availability is very low. In our clay soils, they're like a beast for water, right? When they get wet, they stay wet. When they get dry, they stay dry. Like plants are gonna either drown or dry out. And like the difference between the two is a blink of an eye. But they're like nutrient bombs, right? They have so many good nutrients. We're not likely to run into, there's a couple nutrient deficiencies we have here, but not a lot, right? So like this is the reason to be, if I had to start with a sandy soil or a clay soil, I'd be like, give me clay any day of the week. I can fix clay. Sand is like, I don't know. It's fine. If you're into it, I'm happy for you. And so again, this is a picture. I realized a while ago that whoever wrote the description for our soil type on Wikipedia clearly lives in the area because all the pictures are from the area, and it's got a lot of examples from Raleigh, which I thought was really fun. So this is a picture from Wikipedia actually, but of a soil in Raleigh, right, where this is just straight clay. Okay, like I think you've seen that before on a construction site. That might be your yard. So why does this all matter? It matters again for water permeation and retention, right? Can water get in, and once water's in, does it get held in the soil? Kind of the flip side to that is aeration. If water stays there all the time, it means that there might not be enough air for roots. Nutrient supply and availability, again, clay soils are gonna have more nutrients kind of natively, and also soil strength, which matters more for building, but is like, if I was gonna build on clay or sand, clay is annoying because like 100 years later, everyone's gonna be complaining about their foundation. Ask me how I know. Sand is annoying because it just crumbled when you built it, right? So standard clay soil, standard sandy soil, just to put this in really strong contrast. Clay soils have high nutrient holding capacity, higher water holding capacity, but they're very poorly aerated and they're gonna feel slippery to the touch. Sandy soils have low organic matter content and native fertility. They don't hold nutrients well, but they're very, very well aerated, right? There's plenty of air in a sandy soil. They feel gritty to the touch. And so part of what's interesting about North Carolina is, right, like these soils exist fairly close to each other. And so this is why I like to take a short North Carolina soil history break, because I'm the kind of person who, like, I moved here and I was like, what is happening? What is happening with your soils? With kind of everything going on here, because it's wild. And it's really helpful to have kind of an idea of how things came to be, at least for me, so I can understand kind of what to do about them. So this is the great state of North Carolina, you might be familiar. And so when we think about the mountains, they were actually formed between 1.2 billion and 300 million years ago, right? The Appalachians went up and down and up and down and up and down any number of different times. And now we think of them as kind of this very gentle mountain range, but they were very extreme at some points, right? So there's all this up and down, and they're higher elevation. This kind of central Piedmont area was added about 300 million years ago. There's a couple of different ideas on, like, I think exactly how that could have happened, but it is a different soil type than everything over here, right? Like, this is where you start getting into the clay soils. And part of that is because this is cooler and higher elevation, but there's some other reasons those might be quite different. And then finally, the sand out on the eastern part of the state and toward the coast was deposited millions to about 65 million years ago, right? So you think about those as being sands that are actually deposited from higher and lower sea levels. And what that tells me is that, like, these are mountains, this is something else entirely, and these are sands that are deposited. So these are actually all gonna operate so differently. But spoiler alert, if you see a tree out in the mountains and you're like, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, I'm gonna bring it home. Maybe, right? Or if you see something growing out here, and you're like, wonderful, I'll take 2 for the front yard. You're like, maybe, right? The idea of kind of native to North Carolina is a little bit ridiculous. So what we think of when we think of natives is often we think of native to the Piedmont, right? Because a plant from here or here is gonna have way more similarity to Durham than something from here, right? Because the soils are so different. And so how the soils, one of the ways that kind of our Durham-specific soils are so interesting is because we also, in addition to all of that craziness, we have these really, really deep rifts that were forming in this area. And so deep basins basically formed as tectonic plates stretch the eastern coast of the United States. You can think of them as like stretch marks. You know, it's like the stretch marks there, and it's a little bit like kind of funny looking, and it's kind of like a divot. You get these stretch marks forming along the eastern coast of the United States. And then as the Appalachians are eroding, all that material has to go somewhere. So all these mixed materials are coming in from the Appalachians and from other places, coming down and filling these basins. And so you might have heard around here the idea of the Triassic Basin is one of the ones where some of us are in or very, very close to. And so you have this funny thing happening out here where you have almost all clay soils, but you also have very large boulders around, right? Like if you go to a farmer in the northern part of the county, they are all landscaped with these beautiful rocks that are like this big to this big. And it's just because they pulled them all out of their field. And it's because of all this material that came washing into these kind of shallow spots, right? These rifts, basically. And that's what we're working with. And so Durham is fascinating because it's got all these interesting soils. It's got some other weird stuff going on too. But that's why we have basically mostly clay, and yet you keep hitting rocks. Okay. Sounds like really a planter's dream. One of my favorite kind of visual depictions of this is from a magazine article from 2012, right, but showing the different soils of North Carolina. So out toward the coast, you do get this really dark organic soil because of the ocean, but primarily what you're going to have is you're going to have these more organic soils in the mountains. You're going to have our red clays, and then you're going to have sand. And so our soils originally supported this sort of environment, right? So the idea here is that our soils originally would have been really, really good to support forests, a number of other things. They would have had a thin layer of topsoil, but it was effective enough to grow all this. This is what we're set up for. So like, right, the tree keeping should be easy. Look, this is where we are. This is not what most of us are dealing with though, right? Most of us don't feel like we're like 3 well-placed trees away from reconstructing this. And so why is that, right? That's the history of agriculture in the area. Agriculture, for any number of different reasons, led to a lot of organic matter loss. And so that forest I just showed you, that's beautiful, but it requires a thin layer of organic matter on top of the red clay. The red clay really sings when it's got organic matter partnered with it. Agriculture, a lot of other practices, remove that organic matter. We're left with just red clay. More recently, we have a lot of this going on, right, where they're scraping the topsoil for building. They do that because to plant, or to try and build on top of that black topsoil that we think of as so wonderful for planting, it's actually terrible to build on. Your buildings are not going to be sound. It's not a good idea. You should probably do this, but this is really good for builders and not good for planting. Because what we think of is we think of this is kind of our ideal soil. So right, we've talked a lot about our clay. We want our clay is good, but on top of our clay should be this organic matter. That organic matter is really what bridges us to a healthy, living biological soil. So where are we currently, and why do we want to add organic matter back? Currently, a typical Piedmont soil is 16% pore space, 82% mineral, 2% organic. I'd like to remind you that we are looking for something like 50% pore space, right, in these two categories, and about 5% organic, right? We're not where we need to be. We have compacted soils. They're generally acidic, and they generally have little organic matter. This is what you will be planting into. This is what you probably are very used to planting into. And so what can we do to improve the soil, right? The main thing we can do is we can add organic matter. And the reason for that is because clay, remember, clay is so dastardly because it's so tiny and so flat, and it just compacts, right? It's like those grains of rice or that deck of cards. Organic matter is even smaller. So organic matter can get between those clay particles, kind of jimmy them apart slightly, get them to act a little bit better. If you add organic matter to a sandy soil, it helps hold water. If you add organic matter to a clay soil, it helps it drain better, right? Any soil you have that you're annoyed by, I'd be like, have you considered adding organic matter, right? That's probably the answer. And so what organic matter is doing there is it's not just improving, hey, it's a lot of clay, but it's improving how that clay is actually held together and how it's actually organized. And that's what we call soil structure, right? So it's not how much clay or how much sand you have, but like, what are the particles actually doing with each other? How is it all built together, right? You can hand me a bunch of Legos, but it's a little bit more interesting to be like, here's a castle, right? Structure is like, what is it built into? More organic matter leads to better structure, which leads to less compaction, better water infiltration, better water movement, and improved nutrient availability. Right, so you're gonna get even better nutrients, you're gonna get even better everything. So one of the things you can do, and we'll talk about this in the planting section, is just adding organic matter. Right, if you have a existing, say you have a lawn and you wanna keep it, to each their own. You can add a 1/2 inch to a 1/4 inch of compost just on the top of the lawn every fall or every spring. You rake it in so that you can see the top of the grass blades, it'll do better, right? It wants that organic matter. You can add organic matter to the top of the beds that you're planting. You can do any of that kind of stuff. You don't even have to dig it in. It's helpful to dig it in, but you don't have to because it's so small it's gonna get carried in by rainwater. And over the years, your soil gets significantly better. Like adding organic matter is what pays off in dividends. Because not only does it improve structure, but it also attracts soil organisms, and they do so much work to improve structure as well. So as the soil gets better, more organisms will come. They will create more pore space, right? Like the worms wiggling through and all the little critters that are also helping nutrients be more available. There's a bunch of soil biology that's going to make nutrients more available to plants. Many organisms help plant growth and further improve soil structure. So once this bowl gets rolling, it gets better and better and better. You occasionally will see products at garden centers where they're like, we will sell you soil biologicals, we will sell you mycorrhizae. Those can work. Add organic matter, right? Like this is a field of dreams situation, you guys. If you build it, they will come, right? Like add organic matter and everything else will come, right? Soil has a very, very complex food web. So the good thing about this too is that the more complex that food web becomes, the more self-balancing it becomes. So you're less likely to run into really complicated disease problems and that kind of stuff because things balance, right? So many of what we think of as disease or weeds or these kind of things are systems out of balance and they're unchecked. Whereas the more complexity you have, the more likely you are to kind of have things fight each other out, which is what you want. And one of the real benefits is that living roots actually improve soil health further. Right, because those living roots are always like sloughing off sugars and other little things that then the soil microbes eat, and then the soil microbes are happy, and then they help make nutrients more available, and then the plant roots are happy, and then they slough off more sugars and soil structure. Like you start getting this kind of ball of wax going, right, in the best way possible. So the take home from all this is that we have clay soils. We have that for a bunch of historic reasons. That's hard. My condolences. Like you're allowed to sit with that for a while. Then go out and get some organic matter. Get compost, get whatever you can, right? And slowly start adding it to the soil. You don't have to dump bags and bags and bags. But if you were forming a new bed and you wanted to add a couple inches to the top and maybe lightly mix it in, or even just add it to the top, maybe you mulch with compost the first year. And then you just add a little bit more every year. And it's not gonna be overnight, but within a couple of years, you're gonna like start digging and be like, yeah, right? This like looks good, right? And the plants are gonna be happier and healthier. They're gonna do better. You probably aren't gonna need to add fertilizer at the same rate. You probably, watering will get easier, the plants will get healthy, right? Add organic matter, okay? Right, like, just write that down in your notes, underline it, and be like, I learned what I needed to here. Yeah?
Do you have a suggested, like, type of organic matter? Like, do you do, let's say, like, you know, cow compost or mushroom compost, or what kind of compost, like, would you suggest? Or
Whatever I can get.
Whatever you can get, okay.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I want something with, like, be careful that you're not adding something that's actually a fertilizer, right, where it's got, like, high nutrients and stuff, because I'd be like, that's fine, maybe you want to do that, but that's not the same as just adding a bunch of organic matter. When I'm starting a new bed, I tend to build the bed slightly with topsoil and organic matter. I tend to mulch the first year with something like pine bark fines. It's also called soil conditioner, because it's a little bit better, but I know it'll break down. The newer the bed, the finer I want the particle to be. So it's not about what the particle is, it's about like the fineness, because those really fine particles will soak down in the fastest. Whereas with older beds, where maybe I already have a good level of organic matter, I'm lazy, and I don't want to have to do things all the time. So I might do slightly larger mulch. So it breaks down a little bit slower, so I don't have to be out there like quite as much redoing it, right? When your mulch breaks down and you're frustrated because you're like, I just mulched, why doesn't it look like there's any mulch? That's actually it just breaking down into organic matter and going into your soil. So like We are. You add some, but you don't add as much as you might think. But it's because, remember, our ideal soil is 5% organic matter, right? So some people are saying now you actually just backfill entirely with the native soil. You don't add anything else, and there are reasons for that. I tend to still add a little on the mix-in, but that's just because, I don't know. Sometimes it's hard to break a habit.
Can you explain maybe the difference between using a fertilizer versus organic matter compost, and why not just use fertilizers versus maybe over time? Just share a little more about that.
Yeah, so I'm gonna answer that, and then we're gonna take a 5-minute break, and then we're gonna come back and finish up and go outside. Think about organic matter as being, it's the difference between the plate and the meal, right? So when you eat the food, right, it is wonderful, it is nutritious, that's fertilizer, right? It's nutrients, it's all these other things. But you have to have the plate that it goes on, the carrying capacity to actually do that. I'm stretching this, you guys deal with it. This metaphor is getting unwieldy. You're at a buffet, right? You want a big plate so you can get a lot of stuff on there because it's tasty. You still want a big plate though, you can't just carry it in your hands. Organic matter allows you to carry more, it allows to hold more nutrients, it spaces out the soil better so the soil behaves better. It is not the same as giving a plant nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium. It's a tremendous amount of carbon. And it is actually remember that diagram I had with the nutrients moving and they're I want to hang out with that negative charge. Organic matter has a huge number of those negative charges. It has a huge, what we call cation exchange capacity, so it can hold all those nutrients in the fertilizer. It itself, compost, doesn't often have that many nutrients. I mean, it has some, but not a tremendous amount. You add it so that you can hold more nutrients and also so that your soil handles water better. If I was going to add fertilizer or organic matter, I would actually rather add organic matter because I know our soils natively already actually have a good amount of nutrients. What they need now is they need to be rebuilt back with that organic matter that's going to make the whole system work better. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, I think so.
It's just that nutrients are fertilizer is nutrients. Organic matter is soil improvement and nutrient carrying capacity.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take a 2 or 3 minute break. Please grab a snack. And then we're gonna cover a little bit about planting, and then we're gonna go outside and actually plant a tree, okay? So we'll be back at, in 2 or 3 minutes. I'm not gonna tell you. Yeah, that'd be great, thanks. Okay, so planting 101, and this is gonna be fairly straightforward. What I really want to cover with you is the major types of trees you might run into. One of these you're not actually going to run into, but it's helpful still to know what it is. So purchasing your tree, we're going to talk about bare root trees, we're going to talk about container grown trees, and we're going to talk about bulb and burlap trees. You will, as a homeowner, probably not ever do this, certainly not yourself. But we'll talk about what these different tree types are and why you might purchase one or another and what the kind of reasoning for that is. So bare root trees, these are trees that when you buy them, they are literally bare roots. So typically they're mail order, you can get whatever you want, they come and they're little sticks with some roots in a big long mailing box and you're delighted by whatever came. One of the real reasons you would see these trees is it's very, very common for fruit trees to be sold this way, especially if you are kind of becoming a fruit tree person. And it's very important to you that you have exactly this apple on exactly this apple rootstock. You're going to order that from a nursery 3 months in advance. They're going to send it to you in a tube, right? That's how you're going to do that. Other than that, the other reason you might see bare root trees is there are some varieties that are just hard to find around here, and it's you can order them. These are mail order trees. So again, the major pro is that they're ordered and shipped easily. You can often get really interesting varieties, interesting species, all kind of crazy stuff. And it's very, very easy to see and correct root structure problems because there's nothing around the roots, right? So they don't tend to have the same problems. You can see exactly what's going on. Oftentimes they're shipped relatively young, relatively small, so that's nice too. It's kind of a misconception that if you want a big tree, you should buy a large tree, you should buy a large tree. If I want a large tree, I actually often try to buy the smallest version of that tree that I can, because if I plant a big, mighty oak, but I plant him when he's this tall, or I plant him when he's this tall, by the time that this plant has overcome the shock of being planted, this guy will be about this tall and will be established and have good roots, right? So I like to buy as small as possible. So sometimes I will get bare root trees, even of some of our native varieties, just because I can get interesting things and I can get them small. And you'll go and you'll spend $8 on the tree and $25 on shipping, and somehow it's still cheaper than if you bought it at the nursery. The major kind of drawback to these trees is that the roots can be easily damaged or they can dry out. When you get these plants, you got to keep those roots protected. You want to plant them basically as soon as you can. There are ways that you can store them and such. I would say rather just pull that thing out of the box, plant it, right? Get it in the ground. They can need a little bit of extra care initially to get everything established around the roots, to kind of get them well sunk in. They're going to need watering just like everything else, but they can be really nice. I'm kind of getting more and more into like bare root trees. What you're actually going to run into most of the time are container grown trees, right? This is what you buy at the nursery. This is what we're going to plant today. This is very, very common. As a tree keeper, you will probably plant a lot of container grown trees. It's very, very common. These are easy to source. They're easy to care for. I like this example because this is something that's just helpful to know on pruning, that if I was to pick between these two trees, you want something that does still have good structure in the tree, has these lower branches and all this other stuff. This can actually lead to some problems when they've been pruned too high. So you want to go and buy something that looks like a nice normal tree in the smallest size you can buy it in, typically. Pro is that often you'll have the best selection locally, right? You can just go out and buy this tree. You don't have to mail it and see whatever else happens. They can technically be planted any time. There's an asterisk next to that because the best time to plant a tree, whatever type of tree it is always in the dormant season when that tree has dropped its leaves, if it's a deciduous tree. But technically, with these container grown trees, whether it's sitting in that container or it's sitting in the soil, it doesn't care as long as it's getting watered, right? So the reason we say to only plant these in the fall and winter is because the nursery typically does a better job watering them than we do. Right? We plant them and we're like, you'll be fine. And then August hits and he's like, I'm not fine. Whereas if you buy that in the cool season and it's dormant, you have a little bit more time because they just don't have to be watered as much. Big pro to these is that they're often a more reasonable weight, depending on what size you buy them. Right? So obviously a bare root tree is going to be very light. These are going to be kind of a reasonable weight where you can still move them around. They can have very, very, very significant root defects depending on how they were cared for. Typically when these trees are grown, they're grown in small pots and then bigger pots and then bigger pots and then bigger pots. And if they are not moved up to the next size pot in time, the roots will start twisting around the inside of the pot, right? And they'll start girdling themselves, basically root-wise. So this is a tree that died, and when they pulled it up, they found the roots gnarled like that. And that was because at some early point when it was a container grown tree, it wasn't potted up in time. And so those roots twisted back and started growing in. And then when it was planted, that was not corrected. So we'll show a little bit on how to correct that. That can be corrected, right? Like if they had been lucky and caught this at planting, it would have been a better case to even take the shovel and sever that root than to let it keep going like that, right? Because that will just twist back in on itself. The final size, these are the big, big, big guys, bald and burlap trees. These are field-grown trees that are then scooped up and burlapped. They are the largest trees available. I use this loosely. They may have better root structure because they're field-grown, so they're not in a pot where they're going to start girdling themselves. That is if you don't take into account the fact that all of the rest of the roots are gone, right? So imagine that as a wine cup on a dinner plate, we have some problems. So the problem with these trees is that they're often very, very heavy, and you need professionals to plant them. Like you are not going to get this thing home and just like place it here and then place it there to see like how you feel about it, right? And they have to overcome extensive root trauma. And so these are kind of the most extreme case of where I said buy a smaller tree and let it grow. These are very large and they've had extensive root trauma, so they're gonna need a lot of watering, a lot of care. They're gonna be very expensive to buy, they're gonna be expensive to install, they're gonna require a lot of care. Unless you're like managing an estate or a landscape that requires this, I wouldn't go down this road for myself. So preparing for planting, what are we gonna do? This is girling. So first we will remove all trash, tags, or ties from the tree. If you have a label and you want to keep that label, I would move it to a smaller branch and I would have it very, very loosely attached. We'll show that. But all the other tags, trash, the little stake it's tied to somewhat optimistically, all of that you can remove. You're going to want to resolve any root defects. We'll show this when we're planting the tree, but that means taking the tree out of the pot and really scruffing up that root ball to see what's going on, getting your hands in there, even if you're wearing gloves, to feel what's going on in the roots and see if you can find any of this action. If you can find that, cut it. Have your pruners with you, have something with you so that you can cut these. It is better to damage the tree by cutting it than to let it keep going, okay? So this is going to be exposing those structural roots, pruning girdling roots, opening up the root ball. This is the process where we take it out and we actually kind of start teasing the whole thing apart. It's really nice. If you're working quickly or you just don't have the capacity for that at one moment, you can also just cut circling roots. Well, you'll see people do that sometimes where they take the shovel and they just kind of quarter the plant, right? Like you just slam down on the root ball just to cut it, to force those roots right back out, right? That goes back to this idea of meristems, right? It's the same thing where the plant's growing up and I cut, all this explodes out, right? The plant's growing out underground and I cut, all this explodes out, right? So we're just trying to get the plant to start growing roots out again. When you're planting, it's helpful to have your pruners on you as well to just prune out any dead, dying, or broken branches as well, just to kind of clean the tree up if you're seeing problems. When you actually get ready to put that tree in the ground, we want to have a hole that, in the best case scenario, is twice as wide and as deep, so that the top of the root ball is the top of the soil. If you're planting in a street median, or like the little hill strip, or you're planting in a tiny space, or you're planting in really hard clay, or you've just had a long day, right? Like, sometimes you don't get quite this far out, but this is a goal, right? Like, there's best practices and good practices. Right? Someone would be like, what if I can't do that? I was like, you go as far as you can. So you want that hole twice as big as the root ball, like twice as wide. Yeah.
That one looks like it's 3 times as big.
Yeah, they went for it.
Right. That's 3 times as big.
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, I'd probably, like, if I got out there, I'd probably be like, job well done, everyone. You know, they went quite wide on that, on the diagram. Exactly. Here, because of our clay soils, you want to score the sides of the hole, right? So you take your shovel and you don't just shovel down, scoop out, and then put it in. You actually then take the shovel and whack back at the sides, because otherwise you've created essentially a clay pot, right? So we score back. You want the top of the root ball at grade. What we call the trunk flare is exposed. If you look at a tree, as it comes down and joins up to its roots, it's got a flare right here. All of them have it. If you don't see that, it's because someone buried it, right? Like, we don't want lollipops, right? We don't want like a straight stick and then this coming out of the ground. We want this flare, and that flare should be exposed. And sometimes on your container grown trees, the flare will be buried and you need to re-excavate it. So look for that flare and have it at grade. You're going to backfill with native soil. You can add 5 to 10% compost if you want. The reason we don't add more compost than that is because there's research showing that basically if we make the soil in that hole too nice, the tree's like, I'm staying out here. I don't need to go out there. So we want to keep it native soil, but we make the hole wide so that it's native soil, but it's not compacted, it's nice, it's airy, it's amenable to the root growth, right? It can really grow. But we only add a tiny bit of organic matter so that it's still, nutrient-wise, is very similar to what the plant's going to experience. Do you take a moment to step back and make sure it's straight from all directions? The dogwood we have today for our example is not. It's a small tree, it's wiggly, I think that's kind of fun, but like, we'll try to straighten it out. I would probably plant it with its tilt because I think it's funny, but That's just because I think small trees are a lot of good wiggle. And then for smaller maturing trees, orient the branches as desired. So for something like a dogwood that's never going to be a very large tree, it matters where the lower branches are. For something like a huge oak that's going to get, 50 feet tall, over time, it's actually going to lose all of its lower branches. Like almost all the branches you see are going to get pruned up so that you can walk under it. Remember, if a branch is growing here, when you plant it, it is always at that height. Plant cells don't move. That branch is always at that height. If the tree is twice as tall, this branch is still right here. So on a small maturing tree, I really care about those branches and exactly which direction they're pointed. On a large maturing tree, I kind of care, but I don't care that much because I know I'll be pruning all those out over time so that I can like walk under the tree and just have it like a normal large tree, right? And finally, don't forget to mulch. Oftentimes when you're doing plantings with the city or with Keep Durham Beautiful, either they will have something like mulch for you or they will come back and mulch later. The benefit to mulching is it's a way of adding that organic matter in a slow form, right? It helps suppress annual weeds, it keeps the roots cool in the summer, adds organic matter, and we know that mulch is significantly better for trees than turf grass, right? Because if you imagine where grass roots grow, they grow right where those feeder roots grow, and we don't want that competition. And so the most important thing I can say is that when you mulch, again, the root flare or the trunk flare should always be exposed. Don't mulch right up to the base. Keep kind of a donut around it, right? Always have an open space around here, right? You should always be able to see flare hit soil, okay? Keep just a little bit of space there. So, yes.
Back to when you want like the smallest tree.
Yeah.
Is that because they establish faster, or is it like there's fewer defects, or you can see them better?
Yes.
Okay. All those things.
Yeah. But it's mostly because they establish faster, but it's also
Okay.
just because you can like see the rigmarole, right, of what's going on. But mostly it's establishment. Yeah. Yes.
I love mulch. I also have another benefit is that, especially for street trees, if you have mulch around it, it'll kind of keep people from weed eating or, like all the mechanical damage that it has. And I'm just a big fan of the mulch. But yeah, they have that island around, and don't do, like you said, don't do the volcanoes. They don't need like sweaters. They just need
Yeah.
donuts.
Yeah, exactly. It's so good. You guys all officially now have our permission to look at other people who mulch volcanoes where it goes straight up like that and kind of think to yourself like,
You can go further.
you dig them out?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll let
You get to have a little bit of judgment about that from now on. So that's our gift to you. Okay, so we're gonna go out, we're gonna plant this tree. We ready?
Yeah, ready.
It's gonna be a little bit ridiculous. So thank you for suspending your disbelief for what's about to happen.